In the summer of 2024, Nottingham Forest paid Newcastle United £35 million for a 21-year-old midfielder named Elliot Anderson. At the time, Newcastle were under pressure to satisfy the Premier League's profitability and sustainability rules before the accounting deadline, and Anderson, an academy graduate who had grown up at Newcastle, was sold. 2 years later, Manchester City have paid a reported £116 million to sign him. That's an £81 million increase in transfer value in 2 years. So what happened between these two numbers? Because that is where this story gets interesting. Did Elliot Anderson suddenly become one of the world's best midfielders? Did Nottingham Forest simply negotiate the deal of their lives? Or did Manchester City identify something in Anderson that tells us much more about how they intend to play after Pep Guardiola? And perhaps how they intend to become Premier League champions again? Because £116 million isn't the only big number in this story. Pep Guardiola is gone, and City have replaced him with a manager who knows Guardiola's football extremely well, Enzo Maresca. City reportedly paid Chelsea around £17 million in compensation to appoint him. Elliot Anderson, £116 million. Enzo Maresca, £17 million. Total, £133 million. At least £133 million in headline transfer and managerial compensation attached to two central pieces of Manchester City's new era. One will design the football, the other has to make it work on the pitch. And that gives us the question we're investigating today. What exactly are Manchester City betting £133 million on? And more importantly, could that bet put them back on top of English football? Forget the price for a moment. Watch Anderson. And specifically, watch what happens after he releases the ball. He passes, moves, offers another angle. The ball goes elsewhere. He adjusts again. Forest lose possession. And he's already moving towards where the next contest is going to happen. There's nothing particularly spectacular about that sequence. You probably wouldn't put it in a YouTube compilation. But repeat those movements hundreds of times across 38 matches, and something starts to emerge. Anderson covered 411 kilometers in the Premier League last season. Only one player covered more. But distance alone isn't particularly valuable. You can run around for 90 minutes without actually controlling a football match. So let's go deeper. 3,300 touches. Number 1 Premier League. 306 possessions won. Number 1. 297 duels won. Number 1. 104 tackles. Top 4. And there's another number I find particularly interesting. 1,895 high-intensity pressures. According to Opta's season analysis, no central midfielder in the Premier League applied more. Now we're beginning to understand the player. Anderson wasn't dominating one statistical category. He was appearing everywhere. On the ball, around the ball, trying to recover the ball, competing for the ball. And that matters because Manchester City don't necessarily need another midfielder who waits for the game to come to him. They've just lost the manager who built arguably the most sophisticated possession system English football has seen. What Maresca inherits is not a blank sheet of paper. It's a machine. And Anderson looks like a player capable of doing a lot of the dirty work required to keep that machine functioning. But there's one statistic that changes how I look at him. And it's not a defensive statistic. Anderson also completed more line-breaking passes, 376, than any other central midfielder in the Premier League last season. He completed 2,038 passes overall and made 95 dribbles, both the highest totals among central midfielders, according to Opta's season review. That's important because now we're no longer describing a ball winner. We're describing someone who can recover possession and then help move the game forward. Win, turn, break a line, move, offer again. That combination is much harder to find. And there's another piece. Availability. Manchester City's own profile of Anderson emphasises his work rate, and Premier League data shows he started 37 matches last season. He reached the defensive contribution threshold in 26 of those starts, 70.3%. That's not glamorous, but availability is an underrated part of transfer value. A brilliant footballer who can give you 22 league matches, and a very good footballer who can give you 36, aren't economically identical assets, especially when you're trying to win 4 competitions. And then Anderson went to the World Cup. He played in all 8 of England's matches and started 7 as England finished 3rd. Suddenly City weren't buying potential from Nottingham Forest. They were buying a 23-year-old, homegrown, Premier League proven England midfielder who had just demonstrated that he could handle the biggest tournament in football. But £116 million? We still haven't explained that. Here's where transfer conversations become misleading. We talk about transfer fees as though they're player ratings. £30 million means good. £60 million means very good. £100 million means superstar. Football markets don't work like that. A transfer fee is partly about quality, but it's also about leverage, scarcity, contract length, age, nationality, timing, the selling club's financial position, and whether that selling club actually wants to sell. Forest knew exactly what they owned. Anderson was 23, English, homegrown, Premier League proven, highly available, coming off an outstanding individual season, and coming out of an excellent World Cup. That's almost a perfect recipe for an enormous Premier League transfer fee. But here's the question City have to answer. Could they have bought 90% of Elliot Anderson somewhere else for £60 million? Because if the answer is yes, £116 million becomes difficult to defend. Let's remove the name and imagine we're building a recruitment profile. We want a midfielder who wins possession at elite volume, survives physical Premier League games, can carry the ball, break lines with passing, plays almost every week, understands English football, can operate in different midfield roles, and, at 23, still has development and resale runway. Now the pool becomes smaller. That's where scarcity starts affecting price. City aren't necessarily saying Anderson is twice as good as a £58 million midfielder. They're saying this exact combination is valuable enough to us that we're prepared to remove the risk of not getting it. Those are very different arguments. And here's the part we shouldn't ignore. They may still have overpaid. Good recruitment and good value are not automatically the same thing. A player can become extremely important to Manchester City, and £116 million can still have been more than they needed to spend. Both can be true. And there's a fascinating financial irony here. Newcastle Academy, 2024. Forest, £35 million 2026. City, £116 million. Newcastle's sale wasn't simply a football decision. Sky Sports reported at the time that the club needed sales before the June 2024 accounting deadline because of PSR concerns. Anderson, as an academy product, was particularly valuable from an accounting perspective. 2 years later, the same asset changes hands for £116 million. That's not proof Newcastle made a mistake. Their financial constraints in 2024 were real, and hindsight is cheap. But it does illustrate something uncomfortable about modern football finance. Sometimes the player a club needs to sell to satisfy the rules becomes far more valuable than the financial problem that forced the sale. And Forest? They bought Anderson for £35 million and sold him for £116 million. Whatever happens at Manchester City, that part of the deal is already extraordinary business. £35 million to £116 million. But City's side of the deal can only be judged by what happens next. And that means understanding the man who wanted him. If Manchester City wanted a clean break from Pep Guardiola, Enzo Maresca would be a strange choice. He knows City. He coached City's elite development squad. He worked on Guardiola's senior coaching staff. And Manchester City have now publicly said something very revealing. Maresca had long been considered part of their succession planning. Think about that wording, succession planning. This wasn't City waking up after Guardiola's departure and scrolling through available managers. They had been thinking about Maresca. And it goes further. City have confirmed that representatives held confidential discussions with Maresca during the autumn and winter of 2025, while he was still Chelsea's head coach. Now that's where we need to be precise. City say those conversations concerned the possibility of Maresca returning in a transitional leadership role if Guardiola decided to leave. So we shouldn't turn that into a conspiracy story. But it does tell us something important. City had identified Maresca well before his eventual appointment. Why? Maresca's Chelsea story gets oversimplified. He didn't go there and fail. His first season produced a 4th place Premier League finish and Champions League qualification. Chelsea won the UEFA Conference League. Then they won the FIFA Club World Cup. Across that 2024-25 campaign, Chelsea played 64 matches, won 41, and scored 137 goals. In the Conference League proper, Chelsea won 12 of 13 matches and scored 42 goals. Those aren't the numbers of a manager who achieved nothing. He took an extremely young, expensive, and often chaotic Chelsea project and gave it structure. But there were warning signs too. His football could become methodical. There were periods when Chelsea's attacking rhythm slowed, and the very positional structure that helped them control matches could leave uncomfortable spaces when possession was lost. Then came the second season, and before Maresca could complete it, he left. This part matters because it tells us something about City's determination to get him. Manchester City acknowledged that Maresca's mid-season departure was disruptive to Chelsea. Maresca himself has apologised for the disruption. City and Chelsea subsequently agreed compensation when he became Manchester City manager, reported at around £17 million. Chelsea eventually finished 9th that season. Now, it would be unfair to blame 9th place entirely on Maresca leaving. A football season doesn't collapse because of one person alone. But here's what we can legitimately ask. What did Manchester City see in Maresca that made them willing to plan around him before Guardiola had even left? Because they had options. This is Manchester City. They could have looked almost anywhere. Instead, they chose someone who already spoke the language of their football. And that brings us to the biggest risk in this entire project. How do you replace this? 6 Premier League titles, a Champions League, a decade in which Guardiola didn't simply win at Manchester City. He changed what people expected Manchester City football to look like. And now Maresca has inherited the consequences of that success. Because every decision he makes will be compared with Pep. Change too much, and he'll be accused of dismantling what worked. Change too little, and every defeat invites the opposite question. Why hire a copy when you just lost the original? That's the Pep trap. And Maresca seems to understand it. He has spoken about preserving City's aggressive, possession-oriented identity, while also making clear that football evolves, and his City must evolve too. Sounds simple, it isn't, because evolve means deciding which parts of Guardiola's football were fundamental, and which parts belong specifically to Guardiola. And I think Elliot Anderson gives us our first clue. Guardiola's great City midfields were built around control. Players who understood space almost before the space appeared. Anderson brings technical quality, but the statistics screaming from his Forest season are physical and combative too. 297 duels won, 306 possessions recovered, 1,895 high-intensity pressures, 411 kilometers covered. Maybe Maresca doesn't want less control. Maybe he wants City to become better when control disappears. City attack. Possession is lost. Opponent attempts transition. Anderson closes. Duel. Recovery. City attack again. That tiny sequence may be one of the keys to understanding the transfer, because possession football isn't only about what you do with the ball. It's about whether you can recover quickly enough to keep the opponent trapped when you lose it. And that's where Anderson's profile becomes fascinating. There's another complication. Rodri is recovering from back surgery, and Maresca says he will miss the beginning of the season. The obvious headline is, Anderson replaces Rodri. I don't buy that. They are different footballers. Rodri's ability to dictate rhythm, receive under pressure, protect the centre, and control matches from the base of midfield is extraordinarily difficult to reproduce. Trying to turn Anderson into Rodri could actually waste what Anderson does best. The more interesting possibility is this. What if City aren't replacing Rodri with one player? What if they're trying to make the midfield less dependent on one footballer doing everything? Anderson can recover, carry, press, progress, compete. Another midfielder can dictate, another can create. The burden becomes distributed. If that's the plan, this isn't a Rodri replacement. It's an attempt to make City more resilient when Rodri isn't available. And given what City have experienced without him, that's potentially much more valuable. This is where the £116 million has to justify itself. Not on Instagram, not on transfer grades, on the Premier League table. And City know exactly how high their standard is. Their own annual report described finishing third in 2024-25 as disappointing. Third, Champions League qualification, and Manchester City called it disappointing. That's the culture Maresca inherits. So does Anderson move City closer to becoming champions? I think there are 3 reasons the answer could be yes. And one major reason it could still go badly wrong. City don't need Anderson to be their superstar. They already have superstar talent. What they need is for the midfield to survive the ugly moments of a Premier League season. December away games, second balls, transitions, injuries. Opponents who don't allow City to turn every match into a controlled possession exercise. Anderson's profile speaks directly to those situations. Recovery duels, pressing, availability, progression. That's a useful combination over 38 matches. Championships aren't only won by the players producing viral moments. Sometimes they're won by the player who is still available in February, who wins the ball in the 84th minute and turns what looked like an opponent's counter-attack into another City possession. Those actions don't always make highlights. They do change matches. This is perhaps City's most important advantage. They know what they want to be, or at least they believe they do. Manchester City say Maresca had long been part of their succession planning. He already understands the club. He already understands the broad football philosophy, and he has already worked with Guardiola. That's very different from appointing a manager and then rebuilding the organisation around him. Maresca is being inserted into an existing structure. That doesn't guarantee success. Manchester United after Sir Alex Ferguson is a warning against assuming institutional dominance automatically survives a legendary manager. Arsenal after Arsene Wenger went through its own difficult transition. Maresca himself has referenced those post-legendary manager struggles while arguing that City's organisational stability gives him confidence. And he has a point. City are trying to make the transition controlled rather than reactive. And then there is the financial side. Manchester City reported revenue of £694.1 million for 2024/25. That included £340.4 million commercial revenue, £278.6 million broadcasting revenue, and City generated another £95.2 million from player sales. The club recorded only a marginal £9.9 million loss, despite a season without silverware. Why does that matter to Anderson? Because £116 million doesn't represent the same risk to every football club. City have a huge revenue-generating operation behind the squad, and they've demonstrated an ability to sell players too. That financial resilience gives Maresca room. But we need to challenge something here. Money isn't City's monopoly anymore. Arsenal can spend. Liverpool can spend. Chelsea have repeatedly shown extraordinary willingness to invest. Other Premier League clubs have become richer. So City have money isn't enough to make them champions. The advantage is what happens when money, recruitment, and organisational continuity work together. And that's where this project either becomes very clever or very expensive. Maresca still has to coach the team. And that sounds obvious. Until you remember what he's replacing. Pep Guardiola didn't simply possess good footballers. He repeatedly reinvented how he used them. Fullbacks became midfielders. Centre-backs stepped into midfield. Midfielders became false nines. Then City bought an actual number 9 and changed again. The system moved because Guardiola moved. So if Maresca arrives thinking the answer is simply to preserve Guardiola's structure, that's where this could fail. Because opponents evolve too. And the Premier League doesn't care that your ideas worked 3 seasons ago. That's why I don't think the most interesting question is, can Maresca copy Pep? The answer should be no. The question is, does Maresca know which Pep ideas to abandon? And Elliot Anderson may be our first test. So, did Manchester City overpay? Maybe. £116 million is an extraordinary amount of money for any midfielder, and no collection of statistics can guarantee Anderson will reproduce his Forest influence inside a completely different football environment. In fact, there's an important reason his numbers could change. Forest asked Anderson to do enormous amounts of defensive work. Manchester City are likely to dominate possession much more often. That means fewer defensive actions may be available in the first place. Even the Premier League's own fantasy analysis has raised the question of whether Anderson's defensive contribution numbers will decline at City because of a different team context. That's crucial. Statistics don't travel automatically between systems. The Anderson who won possession 306 times for Forest isn't guaranteed to win it 306 times for City. He may not need to, and that's exactly why simply looking at last season's numbers and saying £116 million justified would be lazy. City are betting on transferability. Can his energy survive in a possession system? Can his line-breaking passing work against deeper defensive blocks? Can he remain influential when City have 65 or 70% of the ball? Can Maresca turn all that activity into control? Those questions decide whether this works. Anderson, £116 million. Maresca, approximately £17 million. £133 million. Manchester City have committed at least £133 million in headline transfer and managerial compensation to two people who may define the beginning of their post-Guardiola era. One is a manager who understands the old Manchester City. The other is a midfielder who might tell us what the new one looks like. And that brings us to the question every great team eventually has to answer. What do you keep when the person who built the machine leaves? Manchester City appear to have made their choice. Keep the control, add physicality, add recovery, add another way of moving through midfield, and then trust Enzo Maresca to decide where Guardiola's Manchester City ends and his begins. £116 million doesn't tell us whether Elliot Anderson will succeed. It tells us how strongly Manchester City believe he will. And now I'd like to know what you think. Did Manchester City just massively overpay for Elliot Anderson? Or are we looking at the midfielder who could help put them back on top of the Premier League? Tell me below. And if you want football stories where we go beyond the transfer headline and actually examine the tactics, numbers and money behind it, subscribe. Because that's what we do here. Read the game.